I want to introduce Heidi and Grant to you all briefly, and then I want to give you an outline of where we're headed this afternoon and identify where you'll see some points for interaction. So Heidi Burgess, along with her husband, Guy, who's maybe in the same room, but certainly is in the same house, is the co-director of Beyond Intractability. And I'll drop the link to BI in just a minute. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Colorado and engaged in her postdoc work at MIT. They together directed Colorado's Hewlett Foundation-funded Theory Building Center, now known as the Conflict Information Consortium. She led the original oral history project on civil rights mediation with Dick Salem some 25 years ago. Our friend and colleague, Graham Lum, is the former Senate-confirmed director of the Department of Justice Community Relations Service and my former boss here at Ohio State at the Divided Community Project. Currently, he serves as the director of Stanford Law School's Martin Daniel Gold Center for Conflict Resolution and is the author of the well-received book, America's Peacemakers. We are really excited this afternoon to launch the website of the second Civil Rights Mediation Oral History Project that now combines the original project that Heidi's going to talk a little bit more about in a bit with 50 hours of new transcripts of interviews with civil rights mediators from the Community Relations Service. It's really an exciting opportunity to have these transcripts available publicly and to have recordings of the videos available as well. I want to quickly highlight the individuals who are part of this oral history project and their service with CRS. Then I'm going to turn it over to Grand and Heidi to give you more context about the first project and the second. Then the three of us are going to have a discussion with one another about some of our highlights and perspectives on the project and what we've learned from it. And then at about 1:20, 1:25, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from a few of the folks who participated in the project. I saw Tim Johnson, Ron Wakabayashi, Thomas Battles are already on, so you'll hear a little bit from each of them and a few others as they join us here today. And then finally, we'll try to hold on to about 20 or 25 minutes for conversation with all of you. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll try to answer them live and in writing. All right. So who is a part of this oral history project? There we conducted 12 interviews, and 11 are currently posted. One is not presently complete. The first is from Thomas Battles. He was a conciliator and then a regional director with CRS in the Southeastern Regional Office from 1984 to 2019. Kenneth Bergeron was a conciliator and then a senior conciliation specialist in CRS Region 5, which is in the Midwest, from 1999 to 2020. Ken returned to CRS as a regional director between, I believe, 2023 and 2025. Our interview was before he returned to CRS. Kit Chalberg worked for about 10 years as a conciliation specialist in the Rocky Mountain, Denver region, and then became program director for program development, training, and evaluation at CRS headquarters in DC. James Davis served in the CRS Office of Technical Assistance and as an Administration of Justice Specialist from 1985 to 1992. Patricia Glenn was a conciliator in the Chicago office of CRS in the 1980s and then was promoted to the New York office as regional director in 1989, where she stayed for 10 years before returning to Chicago at the end of her CRS career. Miguel Hernandez was a conciliator with CRS from 1971 to 77. He was laid off, and then he came back in over a decade later in 1988 to 1995. Timothy Johnson was with CRS from 1984 to 2010, and the positions he held were conciliation specialist, chief of field coordination, and senior conciliation specialist. Grant Lum, of course, our colleague here on the call today, was director of CRS as confirmed by the Senate and appointed by President Obama between 2012 and 2016. Rosa Melendez was the regional director of CRS for Region 10, which is in the Pacific Northwest, based in Seattle from 2000 to 2014. P. Diane Schneider was a conciliation specialist and acting regional director of Region 10 for CRS from 1987 to 2008. And finally, Ron Wakabayashi was the regional director of the Western region of the Community Relations Service from 1999 to 2020. Before we move a little bit further, though, we would be remiss if we didn't note that CRS presently has one staff member. And so I'm going to turn it over to Grant Lum, our colleague Grant Lum, to talk about the current status of CRS. Grant?
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Heidi. We are really excited to certainly launch this, the new interviews here, and welcome to all the folks who are online. Just a quick update. Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of difficult things have happened. On Inauguration Day, there were 57 employees in 30 field offices and HQ. Between March and September, of this year, basically DOJ conducted the elimination of CRS. 42 employees then left. On September 29th, DOJ basically gave a reduction in force notices, RIF notices to the 14 of the remaining 15 employees. The Washington Litigation Group very graciously took on this case and filed a complaint on October 24th. 11 civil rights organizations whose CR services were withdrawn basically filed the complaint. It's called Ethical Society of Police versus Bondi. One of the groups is named Two Wrestling Cats, and there was some thought to having Two Wrestling Cats be the lead plaintiff here, but decided not to. And on October 30th, the court denied the request for the TRO, the temporary restraining order. On November 25th, the plaintiffs filed a motion for preliminary injunction to ask the court to prohibit DOJ from eliminating CRS. And just recently, on November 25th was when the plaintiffs filed a motion for a preliminary injunction. This week, there was work on 3 amicus briefs, one by civil rights organizations. 140 organizations from 35 states have signed on. 105 congressional members are also signing on to a separate amicus brief, and one from state AGs and that's all expected to be filed this Friday, December 5th. I do want to give a big shout out to Julius Nam, who's been leading, a former acting director, who's leading much of this effort here. For more information, do go to americaspeacemakers.com and you'll get a lot more there. The evidentiary hearing is possibly in December or in January. So Bill, let me turn it back to you. But I thought it was important. Our goal is the restoration of CRS. It's called the CRS Restoration Project.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Obviously, critically important work that you're a part of, and Julius Nam, the most recent acting director of CRS, is a part of. I dropped the link into the chat, so you can click it there, and it is public, so feel free to share it. So thank you, Grant, for describing what's currently happening at CRS. I want to turn to Heidi for just a moment or two, and I'm going to bring, at least for a second, Peter Salem onto screen, if he's up for it, to highlight the impetus for the first oral history project. And I'm also going to do a screen share at some point in time so you can get a flavor for what the new website looks like. But Heidi, I want to turn it now to you.
Okay. We were approached, I think, 1998, 1999, somewhere in there, by Peter Salem's dad, Dick Salem, who had been a conciliator and then regional director in the Chicago office of CRS. And Dick came to us and said that CRS was downsizing and moving offices and potentially throwing away a whole bunch of documents. And he didn't want the history that was in those documents to be lost, and wondered if we could store them at the Conflict Information Consortium's office. And we talked about that for a while, but decided really that wasn't a good idea because some of these things were confidential and probably shouldn't move outside of CRS. And if we stored them, nobody would be able to see them. At the time, there was no internet. We couldn't put them online like we might have been able to now. So they just would have been in a basement. It wouldn't make any sense. But the way we could gather and share the history that might otherwise be lost was to do oral histories with former and acting CRS employees. And we got pretty jazzed with that idea, and Dick talked to some of his colleagues, and people were up for it. So we started the Oral History Project. The director of CRS at the time, and I quite frankly don't remember who it was, told all of the CRS conciliators and regional directors not to talk to us, that he was afraid that there'd be, I don't know, confidentiality problems or something. So we figured we mostly have to talk to retired folk, but that was actually good because we got a lot of the old history. We talked to, trying to remember who it was, but one of the people we talked to was standing next to Martin Luther King when he was shot. So we really got some of the stories from old times. And that was fascinating. And Ozell Sutton is who it was. That's right. And there were a couple of people who were currently employed who said, we'll talk to you. The other thing I forgot to mention that I might mention is that I got really intrigued with Dick's invitation because we just started something called the Intractable Conflict Project, and we were telling everybody that intractable conflicts couldn't be mediated. And here was this fellow coming from an agency that was mediating racial conflicts all the time. And we were using racial conflicts as an example of intractable conflicts. So with the transitive property, if racial conflicts are intractable and intractable conflicts can't be mediated, then Dick was doing the impossible. So we were really intrigued to try to find out, well, is he lying? Are we wrong? What's the story? And we did come to the conclusion that no, he's telling the absolute truth, and no, we weren't wrong. And there's a way to answer yes and to both of those questions. And I might talk about that more later, or you can read about it in the blog post that we put out on Beyond Intractability Substack on Monday. And Bill will put a link to that in the chat. He already has.
Thanks, Heidi. I asked Peter to join us for just a second as a panelist if he wants to speak a little bit about his father's work on the original Oral History Project. Peter, I'd ask you to come off mute if you're able to say a few words.
There I am. I think this is, first of all, just a wonderful project. I'm so glad to see it expanded. And the only thing I wanted to say about my dad was that he was always a storyteller. He was a journalist. He one of his early jobs was with the Washington Post back in the late 1950s. He always had a knack for spinning a good tale. When he passed away, and we were going through his papers, there were folders and folders and folders of CRS notes. Good journalist that he was, he took lots of notes, and I spoke with Grand about it actually before we decided that we would let them go. I think at that time there wasn't much optimism or much to do with them in the future. I know he'd be glad to see that you have moved on and focus this project on more current CRS folks. So to the extent I can for him, I will extend my appreciation for the wonderful work that you've done. Thank you.
Well, Peter, we're grateful that to have you here. It's always great to see you, and thank you for sharing a little bit about your father and his wonderful work at CRS. I dropped his oral history into the chat for everyone to see as well. It's of course part of the original project, not the new project.
And
So,
he
Grant, yeah, Heidi, go ahead.
wonderful stories.
Grand, I want to turn to you for a minute to describe the impetus for this second project, and perhaps you might talk a little bit about how it developed, and frankly, how the first project helped you as a director of CRS.
Sure. I remember tracking the original project when I first was thinking about joining CRS. I just thought it was amazing to see things like what Dick Salem did, or folks like Nancy Farrell and Ozell Sutton, Manuel Salinas. It's like I just couldn't believe that they were involved in such difficult situations, and it was incredibly helpful both before I started and then secondly after I started to then go back because I then understood it with a different lens. Because when you're then engaged with the agency, to then go back, it was helpful as we went through the difficult situations we went through in a time that I was there. Whether it was with Trayvon Martin and with Sanford, Florida, or in Ferguson after the tragedy of Michael Brown, or the tragedy around the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek. It was just helpful to have other voices of people who had experience in doing so. And I just thought that there was a second and third generation of mediators and conciliators who we should also capture their voices and their experiences and their insights. And many of them whose mentors were in that first generation. Kit Chalberg, for example, has certainly worked with Silke Hansen, for example, and it just so was, and Thomas Battles had worked quite extensively with Ozell Sutton as another example. So, and Bill and Heidi, we were having conversations over the years, and it just seemed like it would be useful for CRS and useful for the field in thinking about dispute resolution and in tracking people who had been working, as Heidi said, in intractable disputes.
Yeah, and Grant, look, there are, as folks who have taught, all three of us have taught in academic environments in conflict resolution, dispute resolution, and law schools and otherwise. And there's so much out there on mediation, traditional civil mediation,
Right.
Evaluative mediation, facilitated mediation, et cetera. What's different about the work of the community-focused civil rights mediator, and why do those differences matter?
Yeah. Important question, especially for those of us who taught, and especially for those people who there's so many folks who are mediators, on this call, different types of mediators, right? I see folks who do more of that court-based mediation and who do labor management mediation. There are huge differences, I think, and some similarities, right? Whether you have a plaintiff and a defendant, or you have a two-party and it's a court-based, you have a 4-hour time limit. There's a huge difference, and I think it leads to some very different questions, right? From a thinking about mediation, when you have like, who should the parties even be, right? In this situation, who should come to the table and who should not be at the table? How does a mediator here gain entry versus in a mandatory civil-based mediation where you pick from a roster of folks, or the court provides them to you? How do you do that? What should the goals be, right? I think it goes to Heidi's question that she's thought about for years, about intractable disputes. What the goals can't be resolving our values in these situations or agreeing to them, right? There's something else. It could be how lowering the temperature in a situation, getting a specific situation where maybe can protesters do it in a safer location, things in ways that don't create the possibility of conflict here. How should the conciliator operate? I remember when I was there, and I remember reading about from Wallace Warfield, neutrality and impartiality, right? What does it mean to operate that way? And I think the questions matters less the names themselves, because that can trip us up. And how can we explain, how do we justify to ourselves as the mediator or conciliator coming in to the parties and to the external parties? What if the New York Times asks? What if a congressional member asks you, how do you operate? Do you operate in a neutral or impartial way? I mean, there's so many questions that the type of mediation, the type of conciliation that CRS does. And there's a lot of artistry to it, I think, because it is more open-ended than closed-ended.
Yeah, there's so many great illustrations here. And of course, CRS, established by Title 10 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, has this strong confidentiality provision that theoretically sends a mediator to jail for a year or imposes $1,000 fine if the confidentiality is broken. And so we don't hear a lot about what's happening inside of CRS, and that's really why this oral history project is so exciting for me. I'll just highlight a couple of quick notes because you mentioned gaining entry in this scenario. You know, when I take mediator students to court, magistrate hands us the file, the bailiff hands us the file. If you're a JAMS or AAA, you know, somebody's calling you, right, as a mediator. But in community-focused cases, you might be Patricia Glenn, and you might get a call from a governor who says, "Hey, there's a conflict at this campus. Go fix it." Click. Now you've got to go do it, and you've got to gain entry with those communities that you don't know, or you might not have a relationship with. You've got to go build trust. Or you might be Rosa Melendez, a regional director in the Pacific Northwest, who's trying to work in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington State, and Alaska. How do you develop and maintain trust and relationships with folks in all of those communities? Well, she's a little old school in this way. She had a Rolodex, literally had a Rolodex. Some of you may not know what that is. I do know what that is, that she kept on her desk. And every quarter, she'd call key stakeholders in each of the respective communities and just check in with them. And she'd take notes on the back of their business cards and say, "Well, how's your wife doing?" Or you had a surgery last month. Are you feeling better? To build a relationship, to build a rapport, and to check in with them on substantive issues. Heidi, it's really exciting to have you as a part of this project because you are the bridge. I mean, you are the core of this project, both the first and the second edition. And so we wanted to turn to you for a little bit to share about how the two oral history projects contrast. Perhaps you can share a little bit of how the responses from the participants were fundamentally different or maybe surprisingly the same.
Before I go there, can I make one bridging comment, which is one thing that remains unchanged is the relationship building. Almost everybody that we talked to, first phase and second phase, stressed the importance of relationship building. Now, it got harder to do as funding went down and staffing got short. Then it was more a story of running and putting out fires rather than being able to do the proactive relationship building stuff. But that's so key to gaining entry, gaining trust, being able to work effectively. And everybody talked about that. Part of the reason I was so excited when Gran called and asked if we'd be interested in doing phase 2 is that it seemed to me that the environment that CRS had to be working in, and I think he came to us in 2019, 2020, something in there. I don't think that George Floyd had happened yet, but there were plenty of things that had, and then things got a lot worse with George Floyd, obviously. I had the sense that bringing people to the table would be much harder now than it maybe was before, that people were much more hesitant to negotiate. They wanted to win. They wanted to make their point. So I was really curious about that. And I asked everybody that I talked to on the second round a question of how this civil rights scene had changed over the years and did they feel it was harder to work with people. And I got answers across the board. Ron Wakabayashi said, yeah, there are problems now. Working with Antifa, the Proud Boys, is certainly hard because they don't want to have anything to do with government. He might have gone farther to to say it was hard, but rather to say it's impossible. I should say I feel a little bit awkward talking about Ron, knowing he's on the call. He should be talking about himself. But anyway, but he also pointed out that they had folks back in the day that they called anarchists, and those folks behaved the same way. So there's more. He acknowledged that there's more of that now, perhaps, than there was before, but there's always been those folks. But what he honed in on is the fact that there's also regular folks. There's regular folks who just want what's fair, and you can work with them, and they are willing to come to the table. So he really focused on working with the regular folks and getting things done, even if the Proud Boys and the Antifa didn't want to have anything to do with it. And P. Diane Schneider really talked the same way. She talked about what she was retired by the time George Floyd happened and the unrest in Portland happened. She had a very interesting story about what she would have done if she had still been working up in Region 10 during the Portland unrest of 2020, 2022. And she said that she would have just gone neighborhood by neighborhood trying to find people who were willing to work with her. Sort of, again, Ron's approach of finding the people who are willing to work and make progress. Tom Battles, on the other hand, another fellow who's on the call, I gather, was much more reluctant. He said that he would be worried about sending conciliators into these really rough situations now, acknowledging that he had been in some really rough situations back in the day, but he saw what was happening now as more dangerous, less controlled, and saw the chances of bringing people to the table and getting them to, I think if I remember right, he used the phrase get to yes, were much smaller than they were before. So answers were all over the board. The other big difference I'll just mention quickly is there wasn't social media back in the phase one, and there is in phase two. And that's just been a sea change in terms of how the disputants are getting their information and what they're doing, and also how CRS operates, because they could both get information and have problems that were generated by social media. So that was a big difference.
I love that illustration about social media. Grand, those of you who are familiar with CRS's work, Grand has talked about how social media had an influence after Trayvon Martin's death, right, in Sanford, Florida, and how things spread more quickly, but things have accelerated significantly since then. Going back to Ron's oral history, there's an illustration that he mentions where he recalls a police-involved shooting of a Black man in the local neighborhood. And you could tell on social media how different parts of the community were grieving. Ron describes it as one part of the community was younger activists who were outraged, but they weren't really connected to the family so much. They were really upset and outraged. Another part of the community may have been pro-police, and another part of the community might have been grieving at the loss of a loved one and a neighbor. And social media is helpful in trying to identify what different interests and perspectives are in different neighborhoods. And so there's so many ways in which social media plays out now in the second edition of the Oral History Project, and obviously didn't exist in the first. Grand, is there anything that you noticed? You've reviewed the first edition of the Oral History Project in serious and robust ways, and obviously been a part of the second. What did you notice with respect to some of the distinctions?
What I would certainly, everything that I think you've all said resonates here. It is interesting to see that I think for the second group, where there I think is a sort of a wider acceptance of dispute resolution than there was, say, in the 60s, where I think in some ways it was more understandable. And what as I was reflecting on the second group, I was thinking about how, and after, personally working with a number of the people in the second group, how each of them what still is the same, I'll say that I'll start here, is the ability to talk to so many different stakeholders. You know, start with Thomas, who just seems to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. He seems to have can find in in so many communities people who know what's the pulse of that community. And as someone like Thomas does, talking to a lot of folks and then having them conveying what are the others thinking? Where are other stakeholders? Because when you're caught in that us and them situation, it's hard to do. I mean, I think, Rosa, she talked about the situation with the wood carvers, and having been in the police department in Seattle, I think brought her, and as a U.S. Marshal, she's able to have both the credibility to bring people together, but also to convey it. And Kit certainly, we talked a lot about, he grew up in CRS, and the identity management who looked young, who was white, who was male, often dealing with communities of color, and then being that, I think that doesn't change, but it takes, because of the times, there is difference too in how someone enters into a situation.
Yeah, I love how you're mentioning or talking through entry and talking about who's at the table. In particular, there's a vibrant story, and I forget who sang it in the first set, where the conciliator said, "Hey, after the death, a tragic death, usually at the hands of law enforcement of a Black man in the community, I'd go into that community and I'd try to gain entry. And yes, I would talk to the mayor and I would talk to elected officials and the city manager, and I'd ask them who to talk to. And they'd tell me some folks. Well, those were the usual suspects. And then I would go to the Black mortician in the community and I'd talk to him because he had the pulse, or she had the pulse of what was happening in the Black and brown community. I'd ask them who else I should talk to. Because those folks who have the knowledge in the community aren't exclusively those with titles, whether formal or informal or nonprofit or city titles, but there could be steps beyond and in different directions. Ken Bergeron told a story about an assessment he was conducting on work focused with educational concerns in Indigenous communities. And he was meeting with the Indigenous leadership and the local non-Indigenous leadership to talk about educational issues. But he learned pretty quickly that they were representing their communities. The folks with the knowledge were layers deeper. The folks with the knowledge were elders who were versed in cultural awareness, a tribal coordinator. They were a social worker and a superintendent in the school district. It wasn't the folks who he was originally talking to, who he had to get into the conversation. But he learned during his assessment that he needed to get to the folks who had more knowledge about the conflict in the community.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that really impressed me about everyone I talked to in both phases was not only their ability to gain entry, but also their ability to be trusted by both sides. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to come in and be trusted by the minority communities and be trusted by the white school superintendent or the white police chief or whoever's in authority. The assumption either is that either you're on their side or they're on our side. And CRS, every one of the folks we talked to was masterful in walking this fine line, and we talked about the notion of neutrality a lot. And were they neutral? And no, most of them said they weren't neutral, but they were impartial. They were fair. And they developed a reputation for fairness. And so I'm thinking back, people that we talked to in the first round, a lot of them were white men. Dick Salem was a white man, but he was trusted by the Native Americans at Wounded Knee. He was trusted by the Jewish population in Chicago during the Skokie KKK march. I should say that he was Jewish, so it wasn't too hard to get trusted by that community, but it was also trusted by the KKK. That's one of the ways I think in which this kind of mediation is different from other kinds of mediation and just super tricky is how do you build trust across these very stark divides?
Yeah, I want to go back to Rosa Melendez's strategy. I told you about that Rolodex earlier and building trust. There's a illustration that really pops out for me. Grant mentioned indigenous woodcarver who was killed by a law enforcement officer in Seattle. In that scenario, Rosa described one of the indigenous representatives of the community, or perhaps it was a different scenario. It doesn't so much matter for the purposes of building trust. Said they weren't sure if they trusted Rosa. Mm-hmm. But one of the other indigenous representatives told her peer, "You will trust Rosa. I trust her. Do not call our relationship into question." Because she had built that relationship, that party to the mediation session, that stakeholder stood up and told her peer, "You won't question what Rosa's doing here because I trust her." And that really demonstrates how building that trust, using that Rolodex, being an advocate for CRS's work pays dividends in mediation sessions, in conversations with community. Grant?
Yeah, I think there's a truth to that sort of, in some ways, more formal. I mean, because you have time. There are also certainly examples from protests. I mean, Ron. One thing I learned from Ron Wakabayashi is, whether it was, say, at the protest in Oakland about the shooting of Oscar Grant, and where individuals are starting to rock a bus. Ron also has that ability, the ability, the network is absolutely critical, and the ability to have that credibility, like identity management in that moment with parties that don't know you, but to very quickly to do that, I think is really amazing, and I think many of them have that. I mean, Thomas and Mildred Dupre Robles, when they were mediating, in protests at Sanford, would show that in real time, and also in the types that you talked about, where with the Dream Defenders who had taken over the State House of Governor Rick Scott and doing shuttle diplomacy, doing more like international, negotiations at some level, and that being a different type of example where, again, the ability to build credibility with protest groups like what were called the Dream Defenders and Governor Scott's staff, right? Governor Rick Scott's staff.
What's really exciting about this oral history project is you can read the transcript, but you don't have to listen to us talk about what took place. You can go straight to the oral history project in phase 2 and say, "Who's Ken Bergeron?" Right? You can go to the website in phase 2 and you can watch the recordings, and you can listen to Graham's voice. You can listen to Ken Bergeron's or Thomas Battles or P. Diane Schneider or Tim Johnson, who's joined us here. You can listen to them talk about the work that they were doing at CRS. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to some of our guests from CRS, like Ron and Tim, and I see P. Diane Schneider, and I see Thomas Battles on as well. Grand and Heidi, I wonder, though, are there any other illustrations from the new oral history that really stood out to you, that were vibrant and dynamic, that you want to share with this group this afternoon?
I'm happy to share one about Kit. I interviewing him was such a pleasure to see first his development to become a conciliar. He started when he was very young, got a master's in conflict resolution from Denver, and how he learned from a lot of folks like Ben Liu, Grace Sage, Philip Areola, Silke Hansen. And then he walks through an example of a mediation at University of Northern Idaho where there was the elimination of the Mexican, there was the proposed elimination of the Mexican American Studies program. There were student walkouts, there were threats. Um, and and what I think he does, and Kit walks it through so well, is what does the process look like, and who should be at the table. There were community leaders who demanded to be at the table and who were not part of the university here, and how Kit Chalberg manages that is, I think, quite beautiful, and thinks through the sort of the process, the long-term goal. They end up with a 20-page MOU. They all agreed, enrollment was low. We need to do something, and that gave them the impetus to increase enrollment, recruit better, recruit professors, and doing that. So I thought that was just a wonderful example. I would encourage folks to either listen or to watch that one.
Thanks, Grant. Heidi?
There were a lot of things I could choose from. I'll bring up one with Ron Wakabayashi, who talked a lot about the incident that Bill mentioned earlier when a Black teenager was attacked by police. It had real shadows of the Rodney King situation and could have gotten out of hand really easily. And Ron knew that there was a role for CRS, knew that he wanted to get involved, didn't have the connections to the community originally, but there were vigils that were being held every night in memory. Well, I think the youth did not die, so it wasn't in his memory, but it was protesting the treatment that he received. And Ron kept on going to these vigils night after night after night. And finally, after 40 nights, somebody came up to him and said, "Hey, who are you?" And Ron explained who he was and why he was there. And that person turned to be his entry in, because must have said something along the lines of, "Hey, this guy sounds like he might be helpful," and got him in. But it was just incredible persistence where most people would have just said, they're not interested, and walked away. He just kept at it. And the end of that story, he shared with me a wonderful New York Times article, which I now realize we need to link to the website, and we haven't yet. A wonderful New York Times article talking about how the whole community decided that violence was not a helpful way forward. And the concern was that there were 3 cops who were put on trial, and there was a fear that they were going to be acquitted, just like the Rodney King cops were acquitted, and the community would blow up afterwards. And it didn't, because not only Ron, but lots of other people were working with people all over. They had tentacles going every which way, convincing people that violence was not going to help their situation, and that they should, no matter what came down from these trials, the community response should be nonviolent, and they should start working together to improve community police relations and Black Latino relations. There were, if I remember right, there were both Blacks and Latinos in those communities and warring gangs. And it was an impetus to really start bringing folks together. And I might use that to circle back to my original question, which was Dick lying or was I wrong? It depends how you define success. And that was one of the things that we asked everybody, first round and second round, is how do they define success? And success is not peace on earth, everybody lives happily ever after. But success was getting people to realize that violence was not a solution to their problems.
Mm-hmm.
Getting people to realize that they could talk to the police chief, and the police chief could talk to them. Getting people to realize that gang violence maybe wasn't the answer. These are huge pluses. One person told me, and this relates to what Bill was saying, success is getting recommendations from people you work with in the past to other people. So the more times they were recommended as, yeah, this is a person to be trusted. That was what this one person, and I frankly don't remember who it was, defined as success. So success isn't the whole story, but there's lots of little successes along the way.
If I could just jump in right there, I think that that's a point that people sometimes who are reluctant to say, why mediate these situations? You're either on one side or the other, right? We are in a time of increased polarization. I think when you watch or read the interviews, what it gives you a sense of is if that mediator had not been there, how much worse it would have been had they not made that intervention. This was certainly true, with Dick Salem and what happens in Skokie. It's just very clear. And by the way, I do want to say, if you had not done these interviews, it's very hard to show the value of what CRS has been. It would have been very difficult to write the book that Bert Levine and I did. And you can't. It's hard right now as you're trying to litigate this just to explain what is it that CRS did and whether it's there in Skokie or in Sanford. It's just in Oakland where Ron worked. It's when you read the transcripts, then you get a sense of the what if, and I think that's where you can see it. Yeah, what is the goal? It may be smaller, but it may be different. But that's important to the parties, right? It's all voluntary. They have to figure out what they want, and it's very hard to get there, and that's where the CRS conciliator made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the Oral History Project is going to make a huge difference, because the notion that CRS is gone, and if they have one person in my book, they're gone, it's a huge void, and all those what ifs can now happen unless somebody else steps into those shoes. And I'm just hoping, like the Ohio State Divided Community Project has been doing a little bit of this kind of work, and community mediation centers, part of NAFCM, have been doing some of this work, and there's talk about doing much more. Somebody is really going to have to go in and fill this void, and this is the best information we have about how to do that.
And I would be
Heidi,
remiss. I just want to say there's a couple of folks from California Conflict Resolution Unit who are on this. Greg and Kendra are here, and they're doing that work right now, as well.
Great. I mean,
So,
somebody's got to do it.
well, one of the things that I find most fascinating is that even when CRS had more staff than it did a year ago at this time, right? A year ago this time had a 50 plus conciliators staff. When it had far more than that, there was always more work to do. And CRS conciliators, Tim Johnson, I recall Tim Johnson telling me, I said, Tim, well, were you able to follow up with folks and make sure that the solutions were durable? Well, he would say, look, I had to go to another project. I had to go to the next task. I had to go to the next assignment. And sometimes you would hear back from communities, but most times you wouldn't. And you wouldn't have capacity to go back. There's so much work here. I think that one of the lessons for me that's consistent across both sets of oral histories is there's so much work here for us to do, for NAFCM organizations to do, for the Trust Network, for Bridging Divides Initiative, for our state offices in California and Michigan and Pennsylvania. And everyone is doing it differently, right? Everyone is doing it differently, and there's still more work to do. And hopefully these stories will help encourage that work and identify different lenses that folks and organizations and local state offices can bring to that work, because there are a lot of communities in need out there. I want to transition now, if that's okay with you, Heidi and Grant, to hear a little bit from our guests who we interviewed who are on there. Of course, Grant is one of them, but I'm going to elevate and promote to a panelist our friends and colleagues, Ron Wakabayashi, Of course, Ron was a regional director in the Western region, and his friend and colleague, Thomas Battles, who is a regional director in the Southwest. At one point in time, they were the only two regional directors in the country. I'm also going to promote to panelist P. Diane Schneider, who, as we said earlier, was based in the Pacific Northwest, and Tim Johnson, who had a number of roles in central office and in the Northeast. I'm going to promote the three of them. Those are the three folks I see on the call. If I've missed someone, please hit me up in the chat. Of course, if you all have questions for Heidi, Grand, or myself, please let us know. We'll try to get to them in the chat. I see some have already populated. And if you have questions for our guests as well, I don't want to put them on the spot, but if they're open to answering them, we'd love to hear more from their voices. So I want to make sure that we give them the floor. So we're going to turn to Ron first for comments or reaction, then Thomas, followed by P. Diane and Tim Johnson. Ron?
Thanks, Bill. I kind of don't even know what to say. Well, I guess the one thing I would like to share is that we all had to learn to become feds, that there was a different role, which is it had a plus and a minus to it. Feds are both loved and hated at the same time. But we have to learn to manage that in making sort of entry, which people have talked about a lot. But I also wanted to kind of say that this is a network. One example I give is, I'm on the West Coast and in the Southwest where, the Latino population and immigration has been an issue for a long time. And early on, I could spot the beginning of what became the Dreamers doing their first march, in Florida. And I got a hold of Mildred, and Mildred, did a wonderful job working with those group of young students. Years later, when I'm working in Arizona with another group of people, and related to the same kind of immigration issues, some of the Dreamers from that project that Mildred had worked on, knew of CRS's work through that. And I just kind of share that to say that there's a network. I mean, the work that Tim Johnson has done in different places, Kit, people in, just in my own region, Rosa and Marquez, James Williams, all contributed and become part of the kind of credibility that you have. But it's also like that each one of these folks does the work differently, and that's understandably, and it should be that way, because we come in with our own kind of background and toolkit. I just want to say that my concern now is that for the next, if we get CRS to come back, the next generation of conciliators that have to do this work will have a new set of challenges. I mean, the trust for government and federal government, I think, certainly will take a hit in this current environment, and that's another process they have to overcome. But thank you, Heidi and Bill and Grant, for doing this project. I think it's going to be really helpful.
Well, thank you, Ron, for your service and to CRS and legacy in Southern California and with the Japanese American work as well. It's so great to have your voice as a part of this project. Thomas, I want to turn to you now and let you share what you like.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, just to talk a little bit about the project, it was a wonderful opportunity to share CRS's story in this format. Heidi, I think you and Helen did a great job with this. It was also a great opportunity as a leader in CRS at the level as a regional director to share my story and service in the work as a leader in a region who has so many cases and so much of a rich history, as they call it, the Dirty South, dealing with racial ethnic conflict and being in the cradle of the South. And in the tension and the pressure to keep that legacy going, because Ozell Sutton was my mentor, and following behind him as regional director. But I grew up in CRS when Gil Pompa was regional director and Wallace Warfare was at headquarters. And but following them along down the road was a lady by the name of Rose Ochi, who was just as committed, and then a guy by the name of Grant Lum, and then Becky, and they did a marvelous job in leading the agency. And then there were others, but I was also happy to tell the story and the work of some wonderful people that I worked with throughout this country in the regions and their commitment to making a difference in this country. And I think that's one of the most important things about CRS, because we were a non-law enforcement sworn agency. The longer the people worked and did their job, the more committed they got into it. And they felt that they made a difference, and they did make a difference. And that's what's so hurtful about what has happened to the agency now. I can tell you hundreds of stories about Mildred going into situations, and I tell you all the time, if I had to go into a fight, I'd take her with me in a heartbeat, without question. But then I had Dion, and Dion was with us when we went Richard Spencer, the University of Florida, and he did a great job. But nobody did training in my region better than Walter Atkinson. Entire police departments, entire police training academies needed Walter to do training for academies, and that took weeks and weeks and months, depending on the size of a department. And Tim Johnson taught us that because he was the administration of justice person at headquarters. And that was Tim's legacy, because we needed OTAS, Office of Technical Assistance, to help us, to help the country. And that's why OTAS was so important to us. So I thank you for the oral history. There was another oral history we did years ago at the Lorraine Motel. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that material. That's why this oral history is so important, because I think it'll outlive us all, and it'll tell the story of this agency. So I think the fight continues, because I saw an email today from the national president, the national chairman of the NAACP, who sent us an email this morning, said, I support the amicus brief. So there are people joining every day onto this project. Grant, I don't know if you saw it, but Leon sent us an email this morning saying that national president, the national chair, says he's joining the amicus. So
Great.
I thank you for this opportunity to share the CRS story, the oral history. It was a great opportunity to talk about CRS and the work that it's done and it's doing. Gaining entry was not easy, but Pat Glenn was a great mentor in talking about and gaining entry. She would teach that every time she had as a training, and I think Kit picked up something from her. And I just hope that we get a chance to bring some of those young folk back that had to go home not too long ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for your service to CRS and the country and your advocacy. It's great to work with you at the Divided and Ron at the Divided Community Project on a regular basis, and I'm so glad that your story is shared with us and your voice is here. I want to bring in now P. Diane Schneider. And so I'm going to add you into the spotlight, P. Diane, and it's great to see you. I don't know that we have met on Zoom. I know that Heidi led the conversations with you, but I'm delighted that you could join us today, and would love to hear any reaction or comments that you have.
Well, it is a pleasure to join the group of illustrious persons. And one thing that occurred to me, and I would like to follow up on just a bit about what Ron was saying, the population and dynamics in the US have been changing over the years, of course. And one of the things that CRS was able to do was, over time, to employ increasingly skilled field staff with broad, diverse expertise and different backgrounds. which then could afford better assessment of emerging conflicts that were occurring and which maybe we hadn't specifically dealt with before, except perhaps the communities had, but weren't in some way able to communicate what was going on. What we found then when looking at these community, racial, and cultural conflicts, our diverse experiences and points of view helped us to, in the post-conflict resolution situations, allowed us to work toward what later began to be called community development, where then we could have some effective inclusion and participation from members of the community that we're so happy to see that we could see what their needs and goals were and help them to find ways to focus on those and to progress and feel that perhaps their opinions were valued. Where in the past, it was felt like they felt they were just shouting into a bucket or something and were not being listened to. So I always felt that was part of the key to finding ways to help communities to develop themselves then so that we could overcome. And of course, I'm a big supporter of the word impartial rather than neutral for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned.
But Pete, I love this illustration of empowerment. That's what you're talking about, empowering communities to make their own choices and be inclusive, frankly. And it's really lovely to have had your voice as a part of this conversation. And I'm grateful for your highlighting the value of bringing in different types of folks to the CRS team to make sure all voices can be heard in conversations. It's such an important concept, and we're thinking in different ways about bringing people into those conversations. So it's great to have you join us here, Pete, Diane, and I'm going to turn now to Tim Johnson. And Tim was actually our guinea pig, I suppose, in the Oral History Project. We tested the Oral History Project with him, and so he was interviewed first. So I suppose it's fitting to give him the last comment here as the bookend here with respect to the project. And so Tim, take it away.
First, I'm very encouraged that some legal proceedings are taking place to try and recapture our agency. Clearly, the need is still there. I was fascinated by the discussion today, how things have changed and how social media is playing a huge part and how tribalism has divided us, not only left to right, but within various communities. And that's an obstacle for any mediator to overcome. I can't just go to one group in a community and say, okay, you're the spokesperson, because there's other spokespersons as well. We also talked about how to build trust. And I think, using past experiences, we were here before and you can talk to so-and-so. That's one way, but another way, and I think this is common to all mediations, you got to sell the process. People don't understand it. People at the highest levels don't understand it. So you have to sell it. You have to say, what is this thing that we're doing? What is this table that we're inviting you to sit at, and why is it valuable? And we also have to look at what is success. is success getting them to the table, or is success getting a written mediation agreement? Or is success, as earlier someone mentioned, getting people to realize that there is a problem? Tom mentioned one of the other things that CRS could do, and that the movement to resolve disputes, disagreements, and difficulties around discriminatory issues must include more than mediation. It has to include establishing dialogues, or assessing, doing training programs, inviting people to sit down and, like Lyndon Johnson said, reason together. The fact that if you look at the employment history of CRS, most people who joined CRS stayed there. Why? Because of what CRS is and what CRS could do and what CRS should come back to be doing. You don't get that in other federal agencies. You get a lot of jumping around. Well, I was at HEW, and then I went to defense, and then I went to there, and then I went to here. CRS, not so much. People stay for 20 or 30 years. And so in closing, let me just say, we still have the problem. We still need to be proactive and reactive. And hopefully this project is going to get that done. Thank you.
Well, Tim, hopefully we'll take a step in that direction and helping to do some of the proactive and reactive work and articulating a memory of the quality work that CRS has done. I just want to build on that comment. One quick reaction to the oral histories that I heard. And some folks used this language, and I know Miguel Hernandez, who's since passed, in his conversation with me, he called his work at CRS a vocation, not a job. And he came back to CRS after being laid off over a decade later. That's how committed he was to it. And it's clear to me that so many folks who have been interviewed in both of the oral history projects just truly believe in this work at the Community Relations Service, the work that community-focused civil rights mediators are doing. And so it's great to have you all on here. We have about 20 minutes left in the conversation. And most of that time, Grant, Heidi, and I would love to answer and respond to questions. If the conciliators don't mind, Ron, Tim, P. Diane, and Thomas, staying on in case you want to jump in and answer a question, we'd love to have you participate in that way, if you're okay staying on the featured screen. There's two questions in the chat right now. One I want to broaden. One is from Jude. Jude writes, the rapid evisceration of CRS by the current administration exposes the deprioritization of funding for collective peace building and reconciliation processes. Under such circumstances, how do we articulate clearly the responsibility of universities for shouldering the establishment of centers for reconciliation, forgiveness, peace, conflict resolution, I suppose, in the internal and external environment? And maybe I want to take this question a step broader than universities as well. And I know, Grant, you've been in the position of testifying about how to justify this work. And you've been in the hot seat before. So perhaps we might start with you and then turn to others if they have ideas.
Yeah, we talked about this a bit in some ways in our Divided Community Project steering committee meeting, and Nancy Rogers, who's on the call. I do think it is a matter of making sure that I started with the universities, university leaders articulating the importance of all the things that Jude talks about, the importance of reconciliation. And I do think the universities should be a place where you can have that sort of independence to doing so. But as we know, universities have been under huge attack under this administration. But you would hope that things like peace, reconciliation, can't it does have a universal appeal, right? That New York Times Siena College poll said the second worst problem in the country is our political division. Like they don't like it. So there is a hunger for people for that. I do think we need to affirm our leaders when they say something positive. It is a collective action issue. We need a lot of people doing it at the same time.
Heidi, you were leaning in, so I'm.
Um, I agree with what Gran said with an asterisk, which is that one of the things that I'm seeing now more in the peace building community than the university community, because I've retired from the university and haven't been in that environment for a while now. But in the peace building community, there is still a strong tendency to bifurcate the good guys and the bad guys. It's us versus them, and them is Trump, and more broadly, conservatives. So if you're somebody who voted for Trump, you're a bad guy. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to listen to you. I don't believe what you're saying. And that's not going to get us out of this. And I think universities can be places that elevate all voices and act as mediators, essentially, to have constructive conversations about ways forward. I also think that one of the things that is good about CRS, and a story that can get transferred, is that they really focused more on ways forward than looking backwards with blame and what happened. Yes, something bad happened. Yes, people should be held accountable. But how are we as a community going to move forward and build something better out of this?
Yeah.
And I think that's what universities can and should be doing. I think that's what mediators can and should be doing. Peace builders can and should be doing this. We've got to look forward to ways to build rather than looking backwards and blaming who's wrong.
Gran, do you want to jump back in and then turn to Thomas?
Yeah, a couple quick points is it's a philanthropic question, right? We need foundations and to donate to this cause, and there is interest right now in the bridge building, right? We can talk about the Braver Angels and a search for common ground. So there is, I think, some interest there, and I'll raise it, right? There are coming from conservative angles. The desire for civil dialogue, the desire for, and so I think there's a concern if you were from the left about this, but I that is a place where I think where this kind of work can also reside.
Thomas?
Yeah, couple of observations. There was always a concern about the political realities that we lived in when you were at CRS. The thing about it, the conciliators and all us always was taught, do what you were charged with doing, and let the director deal with the politics, whatever may come up about your work. And so, and Tim Johnson, who was the OTAS person, always taught when his training, stay between the lines. So we always knew what the party, the conciliator was going to do when he or she was in the field. The University of Utah was where Charlie Kirk was killed. There's a video out now by the university president. She was listening to her students. So there are a number of publications that we have that some of the universities, if they look at them and read them, can draw something from them to help them through this season and this time that we're in. But I point out the University of Utah because we're in this season now, and there's a lot of talk about things happening on college campuses around Charlie Kirk's name that could bring a lot of division in this country. So there's material out there for you. But I mentioned this president of Utah because she's listened to her students, she talked about it, and then she made some decisions, and she acted. So speaking out, listening, and trying to bring people together of goodwill is a challenge in this environment, but it's not impossible. And so and again, like I said, the Divided Community Project has a lot of material and resources that could help some of these communities as well.
Utah Governor Spencer Cox, right, stepped into that moment. He had been behind the disagree better. There is, I think, especially in this toxic, bitter polarized times, an importance of having CRS type work to lower the temperature and to have people disagree better, and to be able to find common ground.
Yeah, thank you, Grant and Thomas. And I am putting a link into the Divided Community Project's resources, our toolkit. Most recently, the Divided Community Project published two guides. One is on symbols, monuments, and contested public spaces. It urges communities or identifies how communities from a design perspective might work through problems with symbols, monuments, and contested public spaces like Confederate monuments, naming problems, other issues. And then the second guide is a guide for communities and campuses that are dealing with divisive issues and want to do so in a proactive way, or if they need resources, it's also an off-the-shelf manual to react, to think about that proactively. Grant, you've got your hand back up, but Thomas tried to pitch it to Tim Johnson.
Let's go Tim first.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go, Tim, do you want to share a little bit more about working between the lines as Thomas pitched it to you earlier?
Sure. Recognizing political realities. I always, when I was in the field and when I was in headquarters and when I went back to the field, what I did was I said, okay, I have to provide a service to the people in the community that is consistent with what our legislation says, as opposed to providing them what I might have favored or felt would be more than what was in the legislation. And the legislation was quite clear: to offer to provide assistance, to resolve disputes, disagreements, and difficulties, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I'm going to offer that. I'm not going to come in and say, flash a badge and say, I'm from the Department of Justice and this is what you have to do. Stay within the lines and say to the people, okay, looks like you have a big problem here. Looks like there's, the possibility of disturbance or violence or disruption to peace, economic concerns, etc. Would you like to figure out a way to resolve that? If you don't, all right, the people who have the problem are going to still have the problem, and they'll do something else. There'll be demonstrations, or there'll be court, or there'll be suits, or whatever. Or sit with me at a table with the opposing parties and resolve it. So again, as I said earlier, it's selling the process. We all sit here and we all agree that, love, peace, and happiness would be wonderful. Let's all hold hands, sing We Shall Overcome. Not everybody agrees with that. Okay, and I love this term. We need to disagree better. What a great concept that is. And I'll write something about that. And I'll give credit to this group for giving me that term. But yeah, that if we sell the process everywhere, in terms of going to the universities and encouraging them to be more focused on peacemaking, I'm suggesting we go to middle schools and to high schools and to teach them to be more focused on peacemaking, which we're doing in Howard County. We're providing, information and training for the schools, but it's not enough. It has to be part of their curriculum, not part of ours.
Yeah, part of their curriculum, not part of ours. I love that. P. Diane, I want to get you in and then answer Josh's question really quickly, and then we'll wrap things up. P. Diane, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to bring forth also the issue that if we don't have effective communication, or if we're not aware that people communicate in different ways, then we may be thinking that we're making some progress when actually we're getting parts of the community to kind of retire and just not want to make waves, which may mean that they won't be able to progress in the way that could help them to come to a resolution. And many of the people that we have worked with in the past don't even mention coming to a table to talk about a document. And especially Native people say, wait a minute, what did documents do for us in the past? We don't even want to talk about document. So that's why it was so important for CRS to have people from such diverse backgrounds and diverse degrees of expertise and points of view, because we had to be very adaptable depending on where we were and who was there. Otherwise, we might have people that we're speaking to very effectively and they're not listening.
Oh, thank you, Pete Diane. And I think that gets to Josh's question about whether a solo approach or an individual approach to this work is really, or a team approach, which is more effective. And I love that Josh is asking this question as the author of the classic mediation article with Leela Love, two heads are better than one, or are two heads better than one? And frankly, Pete Diane, you're getting to that answer. And bringing a diverse team into a scenario may be helpful to gain entry, to build trust, to communicate more effectively, to notice cultural distinctions and differences. There are many illustrations that I could share here. One is Rosa Melendez, again, going to Arizona to support Ron Wakabayashi and his team during demonstrations about House Bill 1060 or 1070 or Senate Bill 1060 or 70 in Arizona. Rosa was brought in to gain entry with Sheriff Joe Arpaio and the sheriff and his team, right? And she was able to help them get into that conversation because she has a culture as a former law enforcement officer from Seattle Police Department, former U.S. Marshal for the state of Washington, and she's respected in that capacity. That's a culture, law enforcement, right? And so that identity, her identity, was useful to gain entry and to communicate, as Pete Diane says, effectively with the stakeholders on the ground in that scenario. Grant, I see you nodding, and then I'm going to ask one last question of Grant and Heidi, and I suppose myself. But before I do that, I just want to thank the conciliators who were here for their time this afternoon and for their serious investment of time in this oral history project, and of course, all of their dynamic work at CRS. So thank you all. And Grant, I want to turn it to you to pick up the conversation.
Yeah, I first want to acknowledge that Julius Nam joined us, who really has been the leader of the CRS restoration project. Just want to thank Julius for all his work in advancing this. And there is a direct line from the oral history project to what Julius is really leading around the litigation to show the value to be able to share your stories. There is a direct line to being able to do that. Secondly, Kevin Averick noted that James Lowy, was in the Lorraine Motel right when Martin Luther King was dead. And I do want to, James Lowy unfortunately wasn't interviewed at the time. I think he had passed away, Ray, but he was a huge pioneer to the creation and to really the early success of CRS. One last note for me is that the work that you all do, that CRS mediators have done, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have, right? Especially as our country is really, unfortunately, tearing apart. Our ability to reason together, our ability to disagree better, our ability to do that is dependent upon third parties. It's dependent upon people to help out who really do want to bridge divides here. So again, I want to thank everyone for their participation and in making this happen.
Thanks, Grant, and thanks for acknowledging the other CRSers on the call today, and for all the important work that's still ongoing that Julius is spearheading. I want to close this session today and try to wrap up by about 2 o'clock by asking Grant and Heidi for any reflection on today's session, and to ask them, well, if you had unlimited resources of time and money, what would you do with the Oral History Project? Heidi, would you like to start?
Sure. Before I answer that, though, I want to echo Grant's thanks to all the folks who are on the call today who took a lot of time talking to us. It's really very wonderful that you are willing to do that. My hope is twofold. I'd like to interview more folks, and I'd also like to do more with the interviews that we have. The transcripts still are rough. They still need cleaning up. The first time round, we coded everything and we sorted it. So you could look up from the first phase and find out what everybody said about entry, what everybody said about building trust, what everybody said about impartiality. This new set has also been coded, but we haven't collated the coding yet. So that's kind of low-hanging fruit that I want to put that in with the earlier stuff so we can add in the more recent observations with the old ones. So those are my two goals, and hope to keep this project going and alive, and mostly keep CRS going and alive.
Grant?
100% to what Heidi said. I do want to thank Bill. This would not have happened. We would not have gotten here, but for your stewardship as well here. I would add, yes, more interviews. The ability to analyze across those interviews for trends, patterns. I think there's a lot. Arthur Garrity, the judge, said the CRS conciliators are worth their weight in gold. There's a lot of gold in these interviews, and we just have to mine it and present it, because I think there are approaches to gaining entry, credibility, all these things that we can do so much more with. And I would also like to see maybe interviewing some of the recipients of the CRS services here. That would be really striking to get the perspective of those who receive the services, who can answer the what if questions as well here. But I thank you all for those in attendance, and certainly thank you those that were interviewed.
Yeah, and thank you both. And there's one other person that we need to thank today, and that's Guy Burgess, who has been so integral to this project and putting up the website, revising it, and been involved in so many conversations as well. I don't know if he's on camera or not, but I want to make sure that we thank him again for all of his hard work on this project. And I agree with both of you. Maybe I want to take a different approach to what I would do with more resources. And some of these I have, or Divided Community Project has already, but I would create more tools for classrooms and communities to understand some of these concepts. And for civil mediators, traditional civil mediators, to understand how these skills are distinct and how they might be able to use the skills they already have and build upon them so that they can support their own communities. It's been a pleasure working with both of you, and I know it's been a long project. It's been a labor of love for me, and I think for the both of you. It's been really rewarding to interview so many dynamic and compelling individuals, and it's been great to work with the two of you, and I know we're going to continue to be in touch. So thank you all on behalf of Heidi, Grant, and myself for joining us this afternoon, and please let us know if you want to stay in touch or reconnect about the project. We will send the links we put in the chat and the resources, as well as this video, out in probably about a week's time once we've done some light editing and put it up on YouTube. So thank you all, and take care.